What if the story of humanity does not begin where we were taught to start looking? What if the silence before our recorded past is not empty, but erased? History, as it is commonly told, opens its eyes only a few thousand years ago. Neat, confident, and strangely abrupt. Cities rise suddenly, writing appears fully formed, astronomy arrives already knowing the sky, and before that, almost nothing. No long childhood, no clumsy learning curve, just a quiet void, and, before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm sharing makes you feel like staying a little longer. If you wish, share the place and time where you are listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together tonight. Perhaps the most unsettling mystery is not what we have found, but what seems to be missing. There is an unease that settles in quietly when one lingers too long on the beginning of human history. Not a dramatic fear, not a sudden shock, but a slow realization that something about the timeline does not breathe the way it should. Civilizations, we're told, awaken almost simultaneously in different corners of the world. Agriculture stabilizes, writing appears, monumental architecture rises, law, ritual, astronomy, mathematics, each emerges with a confidence that feels rehearsed. And yet, before this moment, the record thins to a whisper. For tens of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans are said to have lived much the same way, leaving behind stone tools that change only subtly across immense spans of time. Then, within what feels like a blink, complexity floods the world. The transition is presented as inevitable, even elegant. But inevitability is often a word used when deeper explanations are missing. The ground beneath ancient cities tells a quieter, more complicated story. Layers of occupation lie beneath what we call beginnings, older foundations under newer walls, reused stones worn smooth long before the hands that placed them. In some places, the deepest layers show signs of organization that do not align neatly with the official starting line of civilization. These strata are not dramatic revelations on their own. They are subtle, easy to overlook, easy to explain away. But together they form a pattern of interruptions rather than a smooth ascent. There is also the matter of sudden knowledge. Early civilizations are credited with remarkable precision in observing the sky. They tracked planetary cycles, eclipses, solstices, and equinoxes with an accuracy that seems disproportionate to the tools they are assumed to have possessed. This is often attributed to patience and generations of careful watching. Yet patience alone does not explain why the earliest records already demonstrate an advanced grasp of patterns that require long-term dust accumulation. Knowledge appears not as a rough sketch, but as a refined draft. Writing, too, enters the record without hesitation. The earliest scripts are not crude attempts at communication. They are structured systems with rules, grammar, and abstraction. They record transactions, myths, laws, and cosmologies, as though the concept of writing itself had already been contemplated elsewhere. The expected trail of experimentation, half-formed symbols, failed systems, transitional stages, is strangely faint. When historians encounter these gaps, they often invoke practicality. Organic materials decay, time erases, floods wash away, fires consume. And this is true. Much is always lost. But loss usually leaves scars, partial remains, awkward fragments, anomalies that do not quite fit. What unsettles is not that early evidence is scarce, but that what remains seems curated by absence. Across continents, myths speak of cycles rather than beginnings, stories of worlds before this one, ages that ended in water, ice, fire, or darkness. Teachers who arrived after a great forgetting bring laws, numbers, and the memory of the sky. These narratives are rarely treated as historical sources. They are categorized as symbolic, psychological, or purely imaginative. Yet their consistency across cultures separated by oceans raises a quiet question. Why do so many traditions remember forgetting? Geology introduces its own discomfort. The Earth is not a stable archive. Its surface is restless. Coastlines shift. Seas rise and fall. Entire regions disappear beneath sediment or ice. A civilization built during a period of lower sea levels would now lie submerged, scattered, and difficult to recognize as intentional. What survives would not look like cities. It would look like debris, misinterpreted or unseen. Even when anomalous finds surface, objects out of expected context, structures dated older than their supposed builders, the response is often cautious to the point of dismissal. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, it is said, and yet extraordinary uniformity in the narrative requires its own justification. At what point does caution become a method of preservation rather than inquiry? There is no single artifact that proves a lost global civilization, no undeniable machine humming beneath the sands. What exists instead is a mosaic of tensions, timelines that feel compressed, achievements that appear fully matured, long silences followed by sudden articulation, a sense that history, as currently framed, favours continuity even when the evidence suggests interruption. One does not need to imagine advanced technologies or forgotten empires to feel this dissonance. It is enough to acknowledge that human memory is fragile and that survival does not guarantee remembrance. Knowledge can be lost without malice. Skills can vanish when populations collapse. Languages die quietly. Entire ways of understanding the world can dissolve within a few generations if the structures that support them fall. Still, the question lingers. If this is not the first time humans organize themselves into complex societies, what would such a predecessor leave behind after millennia of erosion, catastrophe, and reuse? Perhaps not monuments, but measurements, not machines, but myths, not cities, but alignments, patterns embedded so deeply into later cultures that they are mistaken for coincidence. The discomfort grows when one realizes how often history has been rewritten, even within recorded time. Libraries burned, texts suppressed, oral traditions dismissed, victors deciding what is worth remembering. If such distortions are visible over a few thousand years, what confidence should one have in reconstructions spanning tens of thousands more? This is not an argument for certainty, but for attentiveness. The possibility that human history contains more resets than progressions invites humility. It suggests that civilization is not a guaranteed climb, but a fragile arrangement, easily disrupted and rarely preserved intact. Perhaps the greatest illusion is the idea that we are standing at the beginning of the story, rather than somewhere in the middle of a long recurring pattern. If earlier chapters were erased not by intent but by time itself, then the absence of evidence becomes less reassuring. And so the unease remains, a sense that the ground beneath our historical foundations is thinner than we like to admit, that the silence before our recorded past may not be empty, but layered with lives, ideas, and failures that no longer speak clearly. If this is true, then the question is not whether there were civilizations before us, but how many times forgetting has already happened, and whether we would recognize it if it began again. The question left hanging does not drift away easily. It settles into the soil itself, into the quiet assumption that the oldest layers beneath our feet must always belong to simpler lives. Yet when archaeologists dig downward, they do not always find a neat regression into primitiveness. Sometimes what emerges instead is continuity that feels disturbed. Beneath many ancient cities lie older ones, and beneath those traces that refuse to align with the timelines printed in textbooks. Streets rebuilt atop streets, walls resting on foundations whose builders are unnamed. In places like Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley, the act of building appears less like a beginning and more like a repetition. Stone replaces mud brick overlays older stone, and the rhythm of habitation stretches backward further than the narrative comfortably allows. This layering is often explained as normal urban development. Cities grow, collapse, and rebuild. Yet there are moments when the depth of these layers becomes unsettling. The time required to accumulate such strata does not always match the known lifespan of the civilizations credited with them. Something older presses upward, faint but persistent, as though history itself is trying to surface. In several sites, the deepest levels show signs of planning. Not grand monuments, but alignments, structures oriented deliberately, foundations laid with care, spaces that imply social coordination rather than temporary shelter. These are not the marks of wandering bands. They suggest settled life, repeated use, and shared intention. And yet, they sit below what is labelled as the dawn of settlement. The discomfort deepens when tools and techniques appear unexpectedly early. Stonework displaying precision that requires practice skill. Surfaces smoothed not by accident, but by design. Even when such findings are rare, their existence challenges the assumption that sophistication must rise gradually and uniformly. History, it seems, does not always move in straight lines. Sometimes the explanation offered is inheritance. Later cultures, it is said, learned from earlier ones, but this only shifts the question further back. Learned from whom, and where did that knowledge originate if no precursor is acknowledged? There is also the matter of sudden abandonment. Entire cities left behind with little sign of gradual decline. Homes frozen in time, tools left where they fell. Layers of ash, silt, or sand sealing daily life in a moment of interruption. These moments are often attributed to natural disaster or invasion, both reasonable possibilities. Yet when similar patterns repeat across regions separated by vast distances, coincidence begins to feel insufficient. Flood deposits appear where rivers should not have reached. Sediment layers suggest rapid burial rather than slow accumulation. In some cases, the landscape itself seems to have changed violently, reshaped by forces that do not respect cultural boundaries. If such events occurred on a regional scale, they would disrupt societies unevenly. But if they occurred globally, the effects would be far more profound. Geology speaks softly, but it speaks honestly. The Earth has not always been kind to memory. Sea levels have risen by hundreds of feet since the last glacial maximum. Entire coastlines, where early civilizations would most likely have flourished, now lie drowned. What was once fertile land is now ocean floor. What was once shoreline is now forgotten. The absence of evidence in these submerged regions is often cited as proof that nothing was there. Yet absence underwater is not the same as absence on land. Exploration beneath the seas is limited, expensive, and fragmentary. What little has been found, stone structures, anomalous formations, worked-looking blocks, tends to be labelled natural until proven otherwise. The burden of proof becomes nearly impossible to satisfy. This pattern repeats on land as well. Discoveries that challenge the accepted sequence are often isolated within narrow interpretations. Anomalies are folded back into the narrative rather than allowed to reshape it. It is safer to treat them as exceptions than as signals. There is a quiet psychological comfort in linear progress. It reassures us that we are more advanced than those who came before, that knowledge accumulates rather than disappears. But history, when observed closely, does not always support this confidence. Empires fall, techniques are lost, writing systems vanish, entire bodies of knowledge dissolve when their social frameworks collapse. Consider how much of what we know today depends on fragile systems: electricity, digital storage, global communication. Remove these, and much of our knowledge would not survive more than a few generations. Stone tools last. Digital ones do not. What would future archaeologists find of us if our own civilization fractured suddenly? Perhaps they would see the same pattern we now see in the deep past. Gaps, sudden jumps, evidence that something existed followed by silence. They might argue among themselves about whether our complexity was real or exaggerated. They might dismiss fragments as coincidence. This thought reframes the ancient layers beneath our cities. They no longer feel like primitive beginnings, but like remnants of stories interrupted. Not failed attempts at civilization, but incomplete chapters. Each layer represents not just time, but forgetting. And if forgetting has happened before, quietly, without ceremony, then the presence of deep foundations beneath ancient cities becomes more than an archaeological curiosity. It becomes a reminder that history may not be a ladder, but a tide, rising, falling, erasing, and returning in forms that feel new only because memory has thinned. What remains uncertain is whether these buried layers belong to a single lost world or to many smaller ones, each rising briefly before being folded back into the earth. The ground does not answer directly. It only preserves what it can and hides the rest beneath weight and time. As the dust settles over these questions, another unease begins to form. If the physical record itself has been shaped by cycles of destruction and rebuilding, then what other forms of evidence might have been altered or removed entirely, not by nature alone, but by human hands choosing what deserves to survive? And that thought leads inevitably away from the soil and toward the record keepers themselves. If the ground beneath ancient cities feels uneasy, the skies above them feel even more so. Long before telescopes, before lenses, before the mathematics that modern astronomy depends upon, early cultures mapped the heavens with a confidence that still unsettles those who study it closely. They did not simply admire the stars. They measured them. They returned to them. They remembered them. Across the ancient world, structures were oriented with deliberate precision towards celestial events that occur only on specific days of the year. Solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills that repeat over cycles longer than a single human lifetime. These alignments were not casual. They required observation across generations, careful record keeping, and a shared commitment to preserving knowledge over time. Such dedication implies stability. Communities confident that future observers would still be there to continue the work. What troubles the accepted narrative is not that ancient people watch the sky, but how much they already seem to know when history first begins to pay attention. The earliest astronomical records do not read like experiments. They read like confirmations. Planetary motions are catalogued with names, personalities, and predictable paths. Eclipses are anticipated rather than feared as random omens. The sky behaves as expected. In some cases, this knowledge appears simultaneously in cultures separated by vast distances, oceans and languages. Similar divisions of the year, similar symbolic associations between planets and deities, similar numerical patterns embedded into calendars and ritual timekeeping. Independent invention is often cited, and perhaps rightly so. Yet the depth of similarity invites a quieter question. Were these cultures discovering the same truths for the first time, or inheriting fragments of something much older? Time itself seems to behave strangely in these records. Certain ancient calendars track cycles far longer than a single civilization's documented existence. Some count thousands of years forward and backward with ease, as though deep time were familiar rather than abstract. Such comfort with vast temporal scales feels out of place in societies supposedly just emerging from subsistence living. Even more unsettling is the accuracy. Precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over roughly 26,000 years, was known, encoded, or symbolized long before it was formally described in modern science. Detecting this motion requires patient comparison across centuries. It demands not only observation, but continuity. Someone had to remember where the stars once were. The official explanation suggests priestly classes, oral tradition, and inherited wisdom passed carefully through generations. This is possible. Yet it also implies that ancient societies were far more organized, stable, and intellectually disciplined than they are often portrayed. It suggests an unbroken chain of memory stretching back into periods we barely acknowledge. Maps introduce another layer of discomfort. Certain ancient cartographic works depict coastlines with a level of accuracy that seems improbable given their supposed age. Some appear to show land masses free of ice, suggesting knowledge of geography from a time before glacial coverage. These maps are typically dismissed as composite works, later additions or lucky guesses. Each explanation may hold some truth, but together they form a pattern of knowing more than expected, earlier than allowed. The common response is restraint. Extraordinary claims must be resisted, assumptions must be conservative. This caution protects scholarship from fantasy, but it can also insulate it from curiosity. When evidence is consistently bent to fit a timeline rather than allowed to challenge it, inquiry becomes maintenance. What lingers is the question of transmission. Knowledge does not appear in a vacuum. It is taught, repeated, corrected. If early civilizations possessed advanced astronomical understanding, who taught the first teachers? Where did the initial framework come from? These questions rarely receive satisfying answers, not because they are unanswerable, but because they lead backward into a darkness the narrative avoids. Myth offers its own uncomfortable hints. Across cultures, figures appear who are described not as gods but as bringers of order, lawgivers, skywatchers, those who set the world right after chaos. They arrive after catastrophes and depart once knowledge is established. Whether symbolic or historical, these stories preserve a memory of interruption followed by restoration. The idea that civilization might be restored rather than invented challenges modern pride. It suggests that progress is not guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost as easily as it is gained. It also suggests that what we call beginnings may be recoveries, partial, imperfect, and misunderstood. Consider how little is required to erase complex knowledge. A collapse of institutions, the loss of specialists, a break in transmission. Writing can vanish within centuries if no one is trained to read it. Mathematics can regress. Astronomy can become myth again. The sky remains the same, but the language to describe it fades. If earlier societies experienced catastrophic disruptions, climatic, geological, or social, their most enduring legacy might not be physical structures, but encoded knowledge. Alignments carved into stone, cycles hidden in ritual, numbers embedded in myth. These would survive where books would not. This possibility reframes ancient astronomy not as a miracle of sudden genius, but as a memory echoing through reconstruction. The sky becomes a stable reference point, unchanged across catastrophes, allowing lost knowledge to be slowly rebuilt by those who remembered fragments. Yet even this interpretation remains uncomfortable. It implies that our ancestors may have known, forgotten and relearned the same truths multiple times. That civilization is less a march forward than a pattern of remembering after loss. As this thought settles, another question begins to take shape. If knowledge could survive catastrophe only when carved into stone or embedded into ritual, what happened to knowledge that depended on fragile media? Libraries, records, teachings not tied to monuments. If the sky holds memories, perhaps the earth does too, but memory, whether written in stone or star, can still be misread. And if ancient knowledge was inherited imperfectly, then perhaps what we see in early civilizations is not the peak of a forgotten world, but the residue of one, which raises an even quieter concern. If our ancestors inherited knowledge without fully understanding its origin, how certain can we be that we understand the origin of our own? The stars do not answer. They only repeat their patterns, patient and indifferent. And somewhere between their silence and our interpretations, another layer of history waits, unsettled, unresolved, and watching. Stone has a way of resisting the stories we tell about it. It does not speak, it does not explain itself, and it does not easily forget. When shaped by human hands, it preserves intention longer than almost any other material. This is why the oldest stone structures feel unsettling. They endure long after their builders have vanished, quietly contradicting assumptions placed upon them. Across the ancient world, massive stone constructions appear with a suddenness that mirrors the emergence of civilization itself. They are not tentative, they are not experimental. Blocks weighing tens, sometimes hundreds of tons are cut, transported and fitted together with precision that leaves barely a seam. The scale alone raises questions, but it is the consistency of technique that troubles most. Similar methods appear in regions that, according to accepted history, had no contact with one another. Explanations often focus on labour. Enough hands, it is said, can move anything. Time and repetition can account for precision. These arguments are not without merit. Human ingenuity should not be underestimated. Yet they quietly avoid another question: organisation. To quarry, move and assemble such structures requires not just strength, but planning, logistics, and shared knowledge. It requires an understanding of geometry, leverage, and material behaviour that goes beyond improvisation. What feels strange is not that ancient people built with stone, but that they seem to know exactly how to do it from the very beginning. The earliest monumental works already display mastery. There is no visible learning curve carved into the archaeological record. One would expect to find failed attempts, collapsed prototypes, transitional forms. Instead, the record jumps straight to competence. In many cases, later cultures appear unable to replicate the achievements of their predecessors. Stones are reused but not replaced. Repairs are rough where originals were elegant. Legends emerge about ancestors or beings of the past who are greater builders. This reversal, where technology appears to decline rather than advance, sits uncomfortably within a narrative of steady progress. Some structures incorporate alignments and measurements that suggest an advanced grasp of mathematics. Ratios repeat, angles converge with intention, distances encode relationships between earth and sky. These patterns are often dismissed as coincidence or overinterpretation, but coincidence becomes harder to accept when repetition spans continents and centuries. There is also the question of purpose. Many of these structures do not conform neatly to practical explanations. They are not defensive in obvious ways. They are not always located where resources or trade routes would demand. Instead, they occupy liminal spaces, plateaus, deserts, highlands, places chosen not for convenience, but for significance. Mainstream interpretations often invoke ritual or religion, and perhaps rightly so. Yet ritual itself requires explanation. Why invest such effort, precision, and coordination into stone arrangements unless they served a function deeply embedded in the worldview of their builders? And why do those worldviews seem so preoccupied with cycles, alignments, and cosmic order? The deeper unease comes from chronology. Some stone structures appear older than the civilizations officially credited with them. Dating techniques, while sophisticated, are not infallible. They often date surrounding material rather than the stone itself. A structure may be far older than the organic remains found nearby. When dates drift backward, interpretations become cautious. When they drift too far, they are often contested. This caution is understandable. To accept radically earlier dates would require rewriting large sections of human history. It would raise uncomfortable questions about who built these structures and what they knew. It would imply that complex societies may have existed long before we currently allow. One response is to compartmentalize. Each anomalous structure is treated as an isolated mystery rather than part of a broader pattern. This prevents speculation from running wild, but it also prevents synthesis. Without synthesis, patterns remain invisible. Stone does not decay like wood or bone. It persists through floods, fires, and the slow violence of time. If earlier civilizations existed and were erased by catastrophe, stone would be their most likely legacy. But stone alone cannot tell us who its builders were or how they lived. It only tells us that they were capable. There is a quiet irony here. The very durability of stone may obscure its meaning. When structures survive long enough, They become detached from their original context. Later cultures reinterpret them, mythologize them, or simply reuse them. Over time, original intent dissolves, replaced by stories layered atop stone like sediment. This process is visible even within recorded history. Temples become churches, fortresses become cities, sacred spaces shift identity while retaining their physical form. If this can happen over centuries, what happens over millennia? The temptation is to imagine a single lost civilization, a grand predecessor whose ruins dot the globe. This image is compelling, but perhaps unnecessary. It may be more accurate and more unsettling to imagine multiple rises and collapses, smaller worlds, each reaching moments of sophistication before being undone, each leaving fragments behind mistaken for anomalies rather than echoes. Stone structures then become markers not of origin, but of interruption. They suggest that knowledge once reached heights that later generations struggled to comprehend. They imply that the story of human capability is not linear, but cyclical. As this realization settles, another layer of doubt emerges. If monumental stone was built by societies capable of such coordination and knowledge, then where are their tools, their texts, their daily objects? Perhaps they were made of materials that did not survive. Perhaps they were deliberately removed, or perhaps we have not learned how to recognize them. The silence around these questions is not always intentional. Sometimes it is born of disciplinary boundaries. Archaeology studies objects. Geology studies earth. Astronomy studies sky. When evidence spans all three, it can fall between them, belonging fully to none. Stone stands at this intersection, pointing upward and downward at once. It invites us to consider that the builders of the past may have understood their world differently, integrating earth and sky into a unified system of meaning, a system we now see only in fragments. And if those fragments already strain our timelines, what happens when we begin to examine the softer evidence, the stories, symbols and memories that survived not in stone, but in language? Because stone endures, but stories travel, and the stories that follow are even harder to dismiss. Stories are lighter than stone, and because of that they travel farther. They pass through generations not by weight, but by repetition, by ritual, by the quiet insistence that something once known must not be forgotten. When these stories surface across distant cultures carrying similar shapes and concerns, they introduce a different kind of unease. Not the unease of physical impossibility, but of memory behaving in ways that resist coincidence. In many ancient traditions, civilization does not begin, it resumes. The language used is subtle, almost evasive. People speak of restorations after chaos, of laws given again, of order returned to a world that had already known it. There is rarely celebration of invention. Instead, there is reverence for inheritance. Knowledge arrives already formed, carried by figures described not as creators, but as rememberers. These figures vary in name and image, yet their roles align. They teach agriculture, writing, astronomy, measurement. They arrive after catastrophe and depart once balance is re-established. Their presence marks a hinge in time, a moment when disorder yields to structure. What matters is not whether these figures were historical individuals or symbolic constructs. What matters is the consistency of the role they play across cultures that had no obvious contact. Myth, in academic contexts, is often treated as a mirror of psychology or social need. Floods symbolize renewal. Gods embody natural forces. This interpretive lens has value, but it also narrows the field of vision. It assumes that myth cannot carry memory, only metaphor. And yet, many myths preserve details with remarkable specificity. Sequences of events, durations, geographic markers, even technical instructions disguised as ritual. Flood narratives are the most commonly cited example, but they are not the only ones. Stories of fire from the sky, of long winters, of the sun behaving strangely, appear again and again. These are not vague impressions. They are anchored in lived fear. They speak of interruption on a scale that reshapes the world. What is rarely addressed is the aftermath described in these traditions. Survival is not portrayed as a blank slate. Survivors carry something with them: knowledge, tools, instructions. The world that follows is poorer, quieter, and smaller than the one before. Civilization does not leap forward. It limps back. This framing challenges the modern assumption that early societies were naive. Instead, it suggests that they were inheritors of fragments, pieces of a larger whole they no longer fully understood. Ritual preserves what explanation cannot. Symbol replaces instruction. Myth becomes a container for data too important to lose, but too complex to explain anew. Writing, when it emerges, often serves to stabilize this inherited knowledge rather than to create it. Early texts do not ask fundamental questions. They assert order. They list kings, laws, stars, and gods, as though these categories were already familiar. The tone is archival, not exploratory. This is especially evident in early king lists and genealogies. Time stretches unnaturally. Reigns last thousands of years. Dynasties bridge myth and history without apology. Scholars debate whether these durations are symbolic or exaggerated, but symbolism itself raises questions. Why stretch time backward so far unless the memory of deep time mattered? Genealogies are tools of legitimacy. They link present authority to past order. When those past orders are placed far beyond living memory, it implies not invention but distance. A gap that had to be crossed. Language itself carries traces of this gap. Certain words resist translation. They appear across cultures with similar sounds and meanings tied to sky, order, or origin. Linguists often attribute this to chance or parallel development. But language, like stone, preserves patterns of use. Shared roots suggest shared conceptual frameworks, even if direct contact cannot be proven. There is also the matter of precision hidden within symbolism. Numerical patterns recur in myths that have no obvious reason to be mathematical. Sacred numbers appear tied to astronomical cycles. Calendrical knowledge hides inside stories of gods and heroes. These patterns are not obvious to casual listeners. They reveal themselves only through careful comparison, as though designed to survive misunderstanding. Why hide knowledge at all? The simplest answer is fragility. Spoken knowledge survives when it is meaningful, memorable, and adaptable. Embedding it in story protects it from distortion while allowing reinterpretation. It can survive collapse because it does not depend on institutions. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, their survivors would not rebuild libraries. They would rebuild meaning. Stories would carry what stone could not. Over generations, origins would blur. Teachers would become gods. Instructions would become rituals. Memory would become myth. This process is not hypothetical. It is observable within recorded history. Complex technologies forgotten. Medical knowledge lost. Architectural techniques abandoned and later rediscovered. The difference is scale. In the deep past, the scale of loss may have been far greater. This perspective reframes mythology not as fiction, but as compression. Information reduced to its most durable form. The truth may not lie in literal interpretation, but neither does it vanish into imagination. It remains encoded, waiting for recognition. What unsettles modern scholarship is not that myths exist, but that they align too well with physical evidence when viewed collectively. Floods correspond with geological upheavals, long winters with climatic anomalies, fire from the sky with impact events. Alignment does not prove causation, but it invites attention. Still, caution persists. To treat myth as memory risks opening the door to fantasy. Yet to treat it as meaningless risks discarding data simply because it does not speak in modern language. somewhere between these extremes lies a more patient listening. If early civilizations were indeed inheritors rather than originators, then their myths are not naive attempts to explain the world, but echoes of explanations already lost. Their reverence for the past is not superstition, but mourning. This realization casts the present in an unfamiliar light. If knowledge can survive collapse only when disguised, what knowledge are we failing to protect today? What truths depend entirely on systems too fragile to endure interruption? The stories whisper a warning without accusation. They suggest that forgetting is not an anomaly, but a recurring feature of human existence. That each age believes itself to be the first, because the memory of what came before has thinned beyond recognition. And if that is so, then the myths are not about gods at all. They're about us, arriving again after silence, trying to remember what we once knew and mistaking fragments for beginnings. The question that lingers is not whether these stories are true in the way modern history demands, but whether they are true in the only way memory can survive time. Because if stories are all that remain after collapse, then perhaps the most ancient civilizations are not lost beneath the earth. Perhaps they are still being told. What stories hint at, the earth itself remembers in a different language. Not in words or symbols, but in layers, scars, and abrupt transitions that speak of disruption rather than continuity. When geologists read these layers, they do not see a calm, predictable past. They see a planet shaped by intervals of stability punctuated by violence, long quiet stretches interrupted by moments that reset landscapes, climates, and the conditions for life itself. Ice cores extracted from polar regions preserve atmospheres older than any city. Within them lie sudden spikes and drops, temperature shifts that occur far faster than gradual climate models would suggest. These are not gentle transitions. They mark moments when the world changed in the span of human lifetimes, not epochs. For those living through such events, survival would have replaced continuity as the primary concern. Sediment layers tell similar stories. Thick bands of silt appear where slow deposition should dominate. These layers suggest rapid flooding, massive runoff, and abrupt inundation. Rivers overflow beyond known boundaries. Coastlines retreat. Entire regions become uninhabitable. The Earth does not ask permission before it rearranges itself. The end of the last ice age is often framed as a blessing, a warming that allowed agriculture to flourish. But this warming was not smooth. It came with meltwater pulses that raised sea levels dramatically in short periods of time. Lands once walked upon disappeared beneath the ocean. Any settlements along those shores would have been erased, not ceremonially abandoned, but drowned. This matters because early human societies would have favoured coasts and river valleys. These are the most forgiving environments for survival. They offer food, transportation, and fertile soil. They're also the first to vanish when water rises. If complex societies existed during earlier climatic windows, their most concentrated footprints would now be submerged and fragmented beyond easy recognition. Catastrophe does not leave ruins neatly arranged for discovery. It scatters, it breaks context, it turns cities into debris fields. What remains may not look like intention at all. It may look like natural formations, misinterpreted or overlooked, because the expectation of civilization is absent. Beyond water, the planet bears signs of fire from the sky. Impact craters, some eroded almost beyond recognition, point to collisions that released energy far beyond anything human societies could withstand. Even airbursts, cosmic objects exploding before reaching the ground, can devastate regions without leaving obvious craters. Forests flatten, heat flashes across landscapes, shockwaves ripple through ecosystems. Evidence of such events exists, debated and re-examined, often controversially, but controversy itself does not negate possibility. It reveals discomfort. The idea that human history may have been shaped by forces beyond control challenges the narrative of steady advancement. It introduces vulnerability into a story we prefer to tell as resilient. Volcanism adds another layer of uncertainty. Massive eruptions have occurred within the span of human existence, injecting ash into the atmosphere, cooling the climate and disrupting food systems across continents. A single eruption can darken skies for years. Crops fail, populations migrate or collapse. Knowledge dependent on stable institutions becomes fragile. These are not speculative dangers, they are recorded realities. The Earth has reset environments repeatedly, without regard for what lived upon them, and when resets occur, they do not discriminate between simple and complex societies. They erase both with equal indifference. If civilization requires continuity, of knowledge, of specialization, of trust, then catastrophe is its natural enemy. After collapse, survivors do not rebuild observatories or libraries. They rebuild shelter. Skills narrow, memory compresses. What cannot be immediately used fades. This reframes the absence of ancient civilizations not as proof of non-existence, but as a consequence of fragility. Complexity is efficient but delicate. It thrives in stable conditions and collapses quickly when those conditions vanish. Stone survives. Systems do not. It also reframes myth. Floods, fires, long winters and darkened skies cease to be mere symbols. They become compressed memories of lived experiences, not universal events affecting everyone equally, but regional disasters remembered as world-ending by those who endured them. The temptation is to search for a single cataclysm that explains everything, a definitive reset. But the Earth rarely works that way. Its violence is episodic and uneven. One region floods while another freezes. One culture survives while another vanishes. Over time, these localized endings blur into a collective sense of repeated loss. This repetition matters. It suggests that civilization may have risen and fallen multiple times, not because humans failed, but because the planet is indifferent. Each rise would inherit a landscape shaped by previous collapses. Each fall would scatter fragments into geology and story. Modern humanity has not yet faced a planetary scale reset within recorded history. This absence fosters confidence. We imagine ourselves as unprecedented, because we have not yet been interrupted in the way earlier societies may have been. But the geological record does not guarantee exemption. Consider how much of our current knowledge depends on uninterrupted power, digital storage and global networks. Remove these, and complexity evaporates quickly. Paper decays, servers fail. Data becomes inaccessible. What remains are objects without context and stories without explanation. Future archaeologists, if they exist, may find traces of us that seem contradictory. Advanced tools alongside crude remnants, sudden technological leaps with missing precursors, gaps where knowledge should be. They may debate whether we truly existed as we claim. This thought loops backward in time. It invites empathy for the deep past, for those who may have watched their world dissolve under water or ash, carrying fragments of knowledge they could no longer fully apply. For those who rebuilt quietly, without monuments, because survival demanded humility. Catastrophe does not just erase structures, it reshapes belief. It turns certainty into reverence. It transforms explanation into ritual. What survives is not accuracy, but meaning. If earlier civilizations faced such endings, then the echoes we detect, in stone, in sky, in story, are not anomalies, they are residues. The faint outlines of lives lived with awareness of fragility. This perspective does not demand that we imagine a golden age lost forever. It only asks us to consider that human history may be more cyclical than linear, more vulnerable than triumphant. That beginnings are often reconstructions, not origins. As this understanding settles, another question emerges, quieter but more unsettling. If catastrophe has repeatedly reset human societies, what determines which knowledge survives and which disappears? Not all memory fades equally. Some ideas endure with remarkable persistence, and that persistence suggests selection, not by nature alone, but by human choice. What is remembered, what is taught, what is protected, which leads away from disaster itself, and toward the structures of power that decide what counts as history once rebuilding begins. When the ground has settled and the skies have cleared, what remains is not only rubble, but authority. Someone must decide how the world is explained again. In the aftermath of disruption, memory becomes a resource as valuable as food or shelter. Those who control it do not always do so by force. Often they do so by organization. Across the ancient world, moments of rebuilding coincide with the emergence of priesthoods, scribes, and ruling classes whose primary role is not production, but interpretation. They catalogue time, they regulate ritual, they preserve genealogies. In doing so, they shape how the past is understood and how the future is imagined. This shaping is rarely malicious. It is practical. A fractured society needs coherence more than accuracy. Early records often frame the past as a descent into chaos followed by restoration under rightful authority. Kings are legitimized by divine mandate. Laws are said to be revealed rather than created. Order is portrayed as something recovered, not invented. This language stabilizes societies by anchoring them to something older and unquestionable. But it also compresses history. What came before the restoration becomes simplified, mythologized, or erased. Complexity is dangerous in fragile systems. Ambiguity undermines obedience. A clean narrative, creation, collapse, renewal, serves power better than a tangled one. This pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. Archives appear alongside centralized authority. Calendars are standardized. Texts are copied selectively. Oral traditions are fixed into written form, freezing fluid memories into official versions. What is written gains legitimacy. What is not slowly fades. The act of recording is often mistaken for neutrality. But every archive reflects priorities. Decisions are made about what deserves ink, labour, and preservation. These decisions are shaped by the needs of the present, not the accuracy of the past. Over time, they harden into tradition. It is tempting to imagine that ancient institutions sought to deceive deliberately, to hide the truth of earlier civilizations. But deception is rarely so theatrical. More often, omission does the work. If a past does not serve current order, it is simply not emphasized. Over generations, absence becomes assumption. The destruction of a knowledge is not always dramatic. Libraries burn, yes, but more knowledge is lost quietly, through neglect, disuse, or irrelevance. A text not copied vanishes. A language not spoken dies. A skill not practiced fades. What survives is what aligns with power, belief, or utility. This is visible even in recent centuries. Entire worldviews have been discarded because they conflicted with emerging systems of thought. Cosmologies once taken seriously became curiosities. Philosophies that did not fit dominant frameworks were sidelined. History was streamlined to support new narratives of progress. In ancient contexts, the stakes were even higher. Societies emerging from catastrophe needed stability. They needed to believe that order was permanent, sanctioned, and inevitable. Acknowledging previous collapses, or worse, superior predecessors, would undermine confidence. It would suggest that the present order was temporary. Thus, the past becomes sanitized. Catastrophes are reframed as moral lessons. Former ages become golden myths rather than historical realities. Complexity dissolves into allegory. Memory survives, but in altered form. The power to define history is subtle. It does not announce itself. It works through repetition, ritual, and education. Children learn stories that explain why the world is as it is. These stories become truth through familiarity. Questioning them feels unnatural, even threatening. This does not require a conspiracy. It requires continuity. Institutions persist by preserving narratives that justify their existence. Over centuries, these narratives calcify into what we call history. Modern scholarship inherits this inheritance. Academic frameworks are built upon earlier assumptions, timelines stabilize, deviations are treated cautiously, sometimes skeptically. This caution is necessary, but it also reinforces inertia. Once a narrative is established, challenging it requires not just evidence, but permission. This is why anomalies often struggle to find a home. An artifact that does not fit is debated, reinterpreted, or sidelined. A text that contradicts accepted chronology is labelled symbolic. A structure dated too early is redated or isolated. Each decision may be reasonable in isolation. Together, they form a pattern of resistance. Resistance does not imply malice. It implies risk aversion. Rewriting history threatens coherence. It destabilizes educational systems, cultural identity, and scholarly consensus. Few institutions are eager to invite such instability. Yet history itself is unstable. It shifts as evidence accumulates. It corrects itself slowly, often reluctantly. The question is not whether revision happens, but how much is permitted at once. If earlier civilizations existed and were erased by catastrophe, their memory would pass through filters of power during reconstruction. What survived would be what could be integrated. What could not would become myth, legend, or silence. This suggests that forgetting is not only natural but institutional, not because institutions seek to deceive, but because they seek to endure. Endurance favours simplicity. The unsettling implication is that our current understanding of the past may reflect the needs of those who rebuilt after collapse, rather than the reality of what came before. We may be inheriting not truth, but a stabilized version of it. This realization does not invalidate history. It complicates it. It invites humility. It reminds us that every narrative is provisional, shaped by context and constraint. As modern observers, we stand at a distance from these ancient processes, yet we participate in similar ones. We curate knowledge. We prioritize certain explanations. We decide which questions are reasonable and which are fringe. In doing so, we shape what future generations will consider obvious. The silence surrounding earlier civilizations may not be the result of a single act of suppression, but of many small decisions repeated over time. Decisions about relevance, about credibility, about what fits. And if that is so, then the absence we feel at the beginning of history may not be empty at all. It may be densely packed with stories that were never fully told. The thought lingers, unsettling but quiet. If power has always shaped memory, then the question becomes not what was lost, but what was preserved and why. Because what survives through collapse, through rebuilding, through centuries of retelling, reveals not only what once existed, but what humanity chooses to remember when everything else falls away. If memory is shaped by power and catastrophe, then the human body itself becomes a record worth examining, not as a symbol, but as evidence, quiet, biological, and resistant to narrative. The story told by bones, genes, and physiology does not always align neatly with the story told by culture. Anatomically, modern humans appear in the record far earlier than the rise of civilization. For tens of thousands of years, bodies indistinguishable from ours lived without leaving behind the expected markers of rapid technological ascent. Then, suddenly, behavior changes. Symbolic art flourishes. Complex tools emerge. Social structures deepen. The body remains the same, but something else accelerates. This separation between biological evolution and cultural complexity is often acknowledged, but rarely lingered upon. It is explained as a cognitive threshold crossed, a slow accumulation finally reaching momentum. Yet such explanations tend to smooth over an uncomfortable detail. The hardware was already present. The capacity for abstraction, memory and planning existed long before it was expressed at scale. Why then the delay? Some researchers point to environmental stability, others to population density, still others to chance. Each factor likely played a role, but none fully explains why complex behaviours appear abruptly and repeatedly after long periods of apparent dormancy. The pattern resembles ignition more than growth. Genetics adds another layer of complexity. The human genome contains markers of bottlenecks, periods when population shrank dramatically. Such events reduce diversity and disrupt continuity. They suggest survival under extreme conditions. After each bottleneck, cultural patterns would need to be rebuilt, often from fragments. These bottlenecks are not rare. They appear multiple times across human prehistory. Each represents not just a demographic event, but a cultural one. Knowledge would have been lost unevenly. Skills dependent on specialization would have vanished first. What survived would be what could be taught quickly, remembered easily, or embedded deeply into practice. This makes the sudden reappearance of complex systems more curious, not less. After collapse, one would expect slow redevelopment, trial and error, gradual refinement. Instead, early post-collapse societies often display sophisticated organization almost immediately. Language itself behaves strangely in this context. Fully developed grammatical structures appear early, without clear transitional forms. Linguists reconstruct proto-languages that are already complex, implying that language did not crawl into existence, but arrived as a complete system. The origin of that system remains obscure. There is also the matter of cognition. Human brains have not significantly changed in size or structure for tens of thousands of years. The neurological capacity for advanced reasoning predates its widespread use. This suggests that intelligence alone does not drive civilization. Something else triggers its expression. One possibility is inheritance, not genetic but cultural. Knowledge passed down unevenly, disrupted but not erased. After catastrophe, survivors may retain fragments of prior understanding, enough to restart complexity without reinventing it entirely. This would create the illusion of sudden advancement. Another possibility is constraint. Perhaps earlier societies did reach complexity, but environmental pressures limited their expression. Stability allows accumulation. Instability enforces forgetting. When conditions briefly align, knowledge surfaces again, only to recede when disrupted. The idea that human potential is cyclic rather than linear is uncomfortable. It challenges narratives of inevitable progress. It suggests that intelligence does not guarantee continuity, that wisdom is not cumulative unless protected. Even more unsettling is the question of memory embedded within the body. Trauma can shape behavior across generations. Stress responses can be inherited epigenetically. While such mechanisms are subtle, they hint at the possibility that experiences of collapse may echo biologically, influencing how future societies respond to uncertainty. This could explain the recurring human fascination with origins and endings, the persistent anxiety about collapse, the instinct to build monuments, records, and stories that outlast individuals. These behaviours may not be cultural inventions, but deep responses shaped by repeated loss. If earlier civilizations existed and fell, their survivors would carry not just stories, but instincts, caution, reverence. The sense that order is temporary. These instincts could guide rebuilding without conscious memory of what was lost. This perspective reframes early cultural achievements as acts of recovery rather than innovation. Writing becomes an attempt to stabilize memory. Architecture becomes a defense against impermanence. Ritual becomes a rehearsal of continuity. It also reframes modern assumptions. We often imagine that our intelligence sets us apart from the past, that we are the first to truly understand the world. But if the capacity to understand has always been present, then our uniqueness lies not in intelligence, but in timing. Timing is fragile. It depends on climate, geography, and chance. A stable window can close without warning. When it does, Complexity dissolves quickly. The body survives, culture does not. This raises a difficult question. If earlier humans were capable of the same cognitive feats as we are, what did they do with that capacity during long stretches of apparent simplicity? Did they choose restraint? Were they constrained by environment? Or were they rebuilding from losses we no longer remember? The absence of evidence tempts dismissal, but absence may reflect erasure rather than emptiness. Biological continuity paired with cultural discontinuity suggests interruption, not origin. As we examine the human record more closely, the neat boundary between prehistory and history begins to blur. Bodies remain constant, knowledge flickers, civilization appears, vanishes, and appears again, each time believing itself unprecedented. This is not a claim of hidden superiority in the past. It is an acknowledgement of vulnerability, of how easily intelligence can be silenced by circumstance, of how thin the thread of memory truly is. If the body remembers survival but forgets complexity, then civilization is always temporary, always borrowed from moments of stability, always at risk of being mistaken for destiny. This understanding shifts the focus away from monuments and toward continuity. It suggests that the greatest achievement of any civilization is not its technology, but its ability to remember itself. And if remembering has failed before, quietly, completely, then the biological evidence does not contradict the idea of earlier civilizations. It makes them plausible. The body endures, the mind adapts, knowledge fades and returns, which leads to a final unsettling thought. If our biology has weathered collapses before, and if our intelligence has outlived the civilizations that once expressed it, then what we are experiencing now may not be emergence at all. It may be another reawakening. And reawakenings by their nature always follow sleep. Awakening always brings confusion before clarity. When memory returns in fragments, certainty feels distant, and the past becomes something negotiated rather than known. This tension is visible not only in bodies and myths, but in the texts that survive from early civilizations, especially those that sit uncomfortably at the edge of accepted history. Across cultures, there exist written records that seem to look backward far further than they should. They speak of ages before the present order, of reigns and events measured not in decades, but in spans that stretch beyond conventional human experience. These texts are not hidden. They are catalogued, translated, and studied. Yet they are often treated as symbolic, exaggerated or misunderstood, useful for cultural insight, but dangerous if taken too literally. This caution is understandable. Texts can mislead. They can distort as easily as they preserve. But caution becomes avoidance when certain documents are consistently sidelined because they refuse to fit within established chronologies. When this happens repeatedly, the discomfort shifts from the texts themselves to the frameworks used to interpret them. Many early records adopt a tone that is archival rather than speculative. They list events, lineages, and transitions with little embellishment. The language is matter of fact, almost indifferent. What unsettles is not their style, but their scale. Time is treated expansively, as though the writers were accustomed to thinking beyond the span of individual lives or even generations. Scholars often respond by invoking symbolism. Long reigns represent dynasties. Gods represent concepts. Numbers represent cycles rather than counts. These interpretations are plausible and often insightful, but they also raise a question. Why encode history in ways that so easily invite misreading? Why risk distortion if clarity were possible? One answer is distance. When the gap between present and past becomes too wide, precision dissolves. Memory stretches, compresses, and mythologizes. But another possibility is that the writers themselves were already distant from the events they recorded. They may have been transcribing inherited knowledge rather than direct experience. This would explain the tone. A scribe recording an ancient account does not speculate. They copy. They preserve what has been handed down, even if it no longer makes sense. In doing so, they transmit uncertainty alongside information. The discomfort deepens when similar motifs appear in texts separated by geography and language. Lists of ages, sequences of decline, transitions marked by catastrophe rather than progress. These are not identical narratives, but they rhyme. Each suggests a memory of before and after, a hinge in time where continuity broke. What if these texts are not origin stories at all, but post-collapse records? What if they represent attempts to reconstruct a past already partially lost? In that case, exaggeration would not be deception, but distortion born of distance. This perspective reframes the role of early scribes. They are not inventors of myth, but archivists of uncertainty. Their work preserves contradictions because they did not feel authorized to resolve them. They wrote what they were given, even when it strained credibility. Modern readers inherit this strain. Faced with timelines that defy expectation, we choose interpretation over confrontation, symbol over possibility. It is safer to assume metaphor than to revise history. Yet revision is not foreign to scholarship. It happens regularly, incrementally. What resists revision is not evidence, but implication. To accept that ancient texts may contain distorted memories of earlier civilizations would require admitting that history extends further back than we currently map. It would require humility about the completeness of our knowledge. Textual transmission itself introduces fragility. Copies accumulate errors, meanings shift, context erodes. Over centuries, words survive while intentions fade. What begins as record becomes riddle. This is especially true when language evolves. Words once precise become ambiguous. Technical terms become poetic. Descriptions of real events acquire symbolic weight simply because their original reference points are gone. Consider how easily modern texts could be misunderstood thousands of years from now. Technical manuals might be read as ritual, fiction mistaken for history, records of catastrophe reinterpreted as allegory. The line between fact and meaning would blur. Ancient texts sit within this same uncertainty. They are neither pure history nor pure myth. They are something in between, documents of remembrance written after forgetting had already begun. What unsettles is how often these texts have been selectively emphasized or ignored. Certain passages are highlighted because they align with accepted narratives. Others are quietly bracketed as problematic. Over time, this selection shapes what we believe ancient people thought about their own past. But ancient people were not naive. They were aware of loss. They spoke openly of decline, of ages that were better or worse, of knowledge that had diminished. This self-awareness challenges the notion that they believed themselves to be at the beginning of time. Instead, they often describe themselves as late-comers, inhabitants of a diminished world. This tone of belatedness appears again and again, regardless of culture. It is a quiet grief embedded in record-keeping. Why would societies at the supposed dawn of civilization describe themselves as living after something greater? Why frame the present as a shadow of the past rather than its culmination? The simplest answer is inheritance. They remembered enough to know that something had been lost, but not enough to restore it fully. Their texts preserve this tension without resolving it. Modern discomfort with these texts may stem from projection. We prefer origins to interruptions, beginnings to recoveries. A story that starts cleanly is easier to teach than one that loops and fragments. Yet fragmentation may be closer to truth. History may not begin. It may resume. If so, then ancient texts are not unreliable, because they contradict modern timelines. They are unreliable because they are incomplete, written by those already removed from the events they describe. Their exaggerations are not lies, but distortions of scale born of long memory. This interpretation does not demand belief in specific lost civilizations. It demands attentiveness to the way memory behaves under strain. It asks us to consider that written history may begin not at origin, but at the first attempt to make sense of ruins. As this thought settles, the role of the modern reader becomes clearer. We are not detectives uncovering a single hidden truth. We are interpreters navigating layers of forgetting. The question then is not whether these texts prove anything definitively, but what they reveal about the human relationship with time. They suggest a species aware of its fragility, conscious of decline, and haunted by the sense that something essential has slipped beyond reach. And if that sense of loss was already present when writing began, then writing itself may be an act of mourning as much as record-keeping. Which leaves us with a quiet, unresolved tension. If the earliest texts were written in the shadow of forgetting, how much of what we now call history is built upon that shadow? And if memory has been incomplete from the very start, then the further back we look, the more carefully we must listen, not for certainty, but for echoes that survive despite distortion. Because echoes, even when faint, still come from somewhere, and somewhere behind the texts we read, there may be a silence that once spoke clearly, before it was reduced to words. When memory fractures and texts strain under the weight of distance, numbers often remain. They are quieter than stories, less vulnerable to embellishment, and strangely persistent across cultures that share no obvious lineage. Measurement in its many forms becomes a subtle carrier of ideas that words can no longer hold. Across the ancient world, systems of counting appear that extend far beyond immediate practical needs. Units are standardized, ratios repeat. Time is divided with care that exceeds the demands of agriculture alone. These systems are often treated as natural developments, arising from trade, taxation, or ritual. And yet, their internal consistency suggests something more deliberate. Consider how early societies measured the Earth. Distances between sites align with mathematical relationships that only reveal themselves when viewed at scale. Angles repeat across continents. Proportions echo between structures separated by oceans. These patterns are frequently dismissed as coincidence, the result of overzealous modern interpretation. But coincidence weakens when repetition persists. What is striking is not that ancient people measured their world, but that they measured it so precisely, so early. Precision requires reference. It requires standards that do not drift. To maintain such standards over generations implies continuity that is rarely acknowledged. Calendars deepen this discomfort. Ancient systems tracked not only solar years, but lunar cycles, planetary rhythms, and long-period astronomical motions. Some cycles repeat over spans longer than a human lifetime. To recognize them requires either inherited knowledge or records spanning centuries. Either way, it demands trust in memory beyond the individual. The common explanation is priestly tradition. Specialists observed, recorded, and transmitted knowledge carefully. This is plausible. But it also implies a level of institutional stability that contradicts narratives of fragile early societies struggling for survival. It suggests that some forms of knowledge were considered essential enough to protect through upheaval. Why protect measurement so carefully? Because measurement encodes relationship. It links Earth to sky, human activity to cosmic rhythm. It situates daily life within a larger order. Losing it would mean not just forgetting facts, but losing orientation. Geometry, too, appears unexpectedly refined. Shapes recur with mathematical properties that modern minds recognize instantly, but ancient ones are assumed to have stumbled upon accidentally. Circles, squares, triangles, combined in ways that encode ratios known for their elegance and utility. These shapes appear not only in monumental architecture but in art, city planning, and ritual spaces. Such consistency implies teaching. Not trial and error, but instruction. Someone knew what to aim for. Someone understood why certain proportions mattered. The absence of explanatory text does not negate this understanding, it merely hides it. There is a temptation to attribute all of this to gradual development, to imagine countless generations slowly refining technique. But the archaeological record rarely shows this refinement step by step. Instead, systems appear whole, as though adopted rather than invented. Adoption implies source. It implies that knowledge existed elsewhere, perhaps in forms that did not survive. Measurement may be what remains when explanation is lost. Numbers endure because they are useful even when their origin is forgotten. This endurance makes numbers dangerous to narrative. They resist reinterpretation. A ratio remains a ratio regardless of story. A cycle repeats whether or not it is understood. Because of this, numerical anomalies are often minimized. They are treated as curiosities rather than clues. Yet numbers quietly connect disparate evidence. They link monuments to stars, calendars to climate, rituals to seasons. They suggest an integrated worldview in which humanity was not separate from its environment, but synchronized with it. This worldview does not require advanced technology, but it does require observation over long periods. It requires patience, record keeping, and the assumption that the future will care about the past. Such assumptions are difficult to maintain in unstable times, which raises another question. If early societies were capable of such long-term thinking, why does so little of their explanatory framework survive? Why do we inherit the measurements, but not the manuals? Perhaps because manuals are fragile. They rely on language, on context, on continuity. Numbers, once embedded into practice, can survive without explanation. A ritual repeated without understanding still preserves timing. A structure built to a ratio still encodes relationship, even if its meaning fades. This may explain why so much ancient knowledge feels simultaneously advanced and opaque. We see the outcome, not the reasoning, the product, not the process. It is like inheriting a machine without instructions, forced to infer purpose from form. Modern science prides itself on transparency, on making reasoning explicit. But transparency depends on systems that preserve information. Remove those systems, and even our most rigorous knowledge would quickly become mysterious. Imagine future observers encountering remnants of modern technology without context. Precision would remain. Function would be inferred. Intent would be debated. They might assume coincidence where design once existed. This inversion of perspective softens judgment of the past. It suggests that ancient people may not have been primitive discoverers of accidental truths, but custodians of systems whose origins they no longer fully grasped. If so, then the precision we observe is not evidence of sudden genius, but of conservation. Measurement becomes an act of remembrance. Each repetition keeps a fragment alive. This idea unsettles because it challenges our sense of uniqueness. We prefer to believe that we are the first to truly measure the world, to decode its laws. But measurement may be older than explanation. Understanding may come and go while structure persists. The persistence of ancient measurement systems suggests intentional transmission across disruptions. Someone believed these patterns mattered enough to preserve even when other knowledge was lost. That belief itself hints at experience, perhaps of loss, perhaps of misalignment when order failed. Numbers do not mourn, they endure. But the care with which they are preserved suggests a memory of what happens when alignment is forgotten. As this thought settles, another layer of unease emerges. If ancient measurement systems reflect inherited knowledge, then what we call discovery may often be rediscovery. What we celebrate as progress may be recollection under new conditions. This does not diminish modern achievement. It contextualizes it. It places us within a longer rhythm of remembering and forgetting. The question that lingers is quiet but persistent. If numbers have carried memory through collapse before, what are they carrying now, unnoticed, embedded in our own systems? What assumptions are we preserving without understanding, simply because they work? And if future generations inherit our measurements without our explanations, What story will they tell about us? Because numbers, once set in motion, do not care who understands them. They only repeat. And repetition, over enough time, begins to resemble memory. When numbers persist without explanation, and structures endure without context, attention inevitably turns to what vanished entirely. Not stone, not ratios, not alignments, but voices. The institutions that once held knowledge together, the places where memory was stored deliberately rather than embedded indirectly. The absences here feel sharper because they are easier to imagine. Throughout recorded history, moments of intellectual abundance are often followed by sudden silence. Libraries disappear. Schools dissolve, traditions fracture. This pattern is usually explained as the collateral damage of war or neglect, yet the repetition of such losses across cultures invites a deeper unease. Knowledge seems not only fragile but selectively so. Written records are especially vulnerable. They require material, labour and ongoing commitment to preservation. When societies destabilise, copying texts becomes less urgent than securing food or safety. A single generation without scribes is enough to sever centuries of accumulated understanding. After that, reconstruction begins from fragments, guesses, and reinterpretations. The destruction of repositories is often remembered dramatically: fires, invasions, iconoclasm. But most erasure is quieter. Texts fall out of favour. Languages shift. Scripts become unreadable. What was once common knowledge becomes obscure simply because no one remembers how to access it. This quiet erasure has consequences. When later scholars encounter gaps in the record, they often assume those gaps reflect absence rather than loss. What cannot be found is treated as what never existed. Over time, this assumption hardens into certainty. Yet the existence of loss within recorded history should make us cautious about applying such certainty to deeper time. If entire bodies of knowledge can vanish within a few centuries, what chance does complex understanding have over tens of thousands of years, especially across periods of environmental or social collapse? There is also the matter of selection. Not all knowledge is preserved equally. Practical techniques tied to survival may endure through repetition. Abstract theories, philosophical frameworks, and specialized sciences depend on institutional continuity. When that continuity breaks, abstraction suffers first. This may explain why ancient civilizations appear simultaneously advanced and incomplete. We inherit their outputs, structures, measurements, calendars, but not the scaffolding of thought that produced them. The result feels uncanny. Effects without causes, answers without questions. In some cases, the erasure appears intentional. New belief systems replace old ones. Competing cosmologies are suppressed. Texts deemed dangerous, heretical, or irrelevant are destroyed or ignored. This is not unique to any one culture. It is a recurring feature of human history. But intention does not require conspiracy. It requires alignment of values. When a new worldview emerges, it naturally prioritizes sources that support it. Others fade through disuse. Over generations, the distinction between suppression and forgetting blurs. This process reshapes history retroactively. What survives becomes what mattered becomes what is remembered, and what is remembered becomes what is taught as inevitable. The unsettling implication is that our current picture of the past may reflect survivorship bias more than completeness. We study what endured, not what was. We reconstruct civilizations from what remained after loss, mistaking residue for totality. Consider how many times knowledge has been reinvented, techniques lost and rediscovered, ideas abandoned and revived. Each rediscovery is framed as progress, but it may also be recovery. The original context is gone, so the rediscovered idea feels new. This raises a question rarely asked directly. How much of what we call ancient innovation was already old by the time it was written down? how many systems we credit to early civilizations were, in their own view, inherited remnants of something earlier, the absence of explicit acknowledgement does not negate this possibility. In societies shaped by loss, humility toward the past may be instinctive. To claim originality might feel inappropriate when memory itself feels incomplete. There is also the psychological weight of erasure. When people know that knowledge can vanish, they may embed it into forms more resistant to loss. Ritual, repetition, symbolism. These survive where explanation does not. They become cultural muscle memory. This would explain why so much ancient knowledge feels encoded rather than articulated. Why meaning is layered, indirect, and difficult to extract. It was not designed for us. It was designed to survive collapse. Modern discomfort with this encoding reflects our dependence on clarity. We expect explanations to accompany structures. When they do not, we assume deficiency rather than adaptation. But adaptation to instability produces different priorities. Imagine trying to preserve scientific understanding without books, without stable institutions, without a shared technical language. What would survive? Likely not equations, but practices. Not theories, but patterns of behaviour. Not explanations, but timing. This perspective reframes loss not as failure, but as triage. When everything cannot be saved, choices are made, consciously or not, about what to carry forward. Those choices shape the future's understanding of the past. If earlier civilizations faced repeated disruptions, their descendants would inherit a filtered version of their world. What remained would feel mysterious, authoritative, and ancient. Over time, that authority would be mistaken for origin. This is how beginnings are constructed, not from creation, but from the oldest memory still accessible. Everything before that recedes into silence, not because it did not exist, but because it could not be carried. The silence at the start of history, then, may not be a void. It may be the edge of survivability, the point beyond which memory could not pass intact. This realization invites a different kind of humility. Instead of asking why there is no evidence of earlier civilizations, we might ask what evidence could reasonably survive repeated collapse. Instead of expecting continuity, we might expect distortion. The past, viewed through this lens, becomes less like a foundation and more like a shoreline, shaped by waves of loss and return. Each generation builds upon what is left, unaware of how much has already been taken. As this thought settles, another question emerges. If so much knowledge has been lost quietly without drama, what remains hidden not because it was destroyed, but because we no longer recognize it as knowledge at all? Perhaps some remnants surround us still, unremarked, embedded in customs, spaces, or assumptions we consider mundane. And perhaps the greatest erasure is not of texts or libraries, but of the ability to imagine that something meaningful could exist beyond the boundaries of what survived. If that imagination has been lost before, it may be the most difficult thing to recover. Because once imagination narrows, the past becomes smaller, not because it was, but because we no longer know how to look beyond what remains. When imagination narrows, power steps in to offer certainty. Not loudly, not with banners, but with structure, curricula, chronologies, authorized sources. After periods of collapse and rebuilding, societies crave coherence more than completeness. Coherence can be taught, completeness cannot. And so, history is arranged. The arrangement rarely announces itself as control. It presents as stewardship. Someone must decide which dates anchor the timeline, which texts are reliable, which interpretations are responsible. These decisions are framed as safeguards against chaos, and often they are. But they also draw borders around the imaginable. Every civilization that endures long enough develops institutions that regulate memory. Temples, courts, academies, churches, states, each claims a mandate to preserve truth. Preservation, however, requires selection. Selection creates hierarchy. Hierarchy produces silence. The earliest surviving educational systems reveal this tension. They teach order by narrowing attention. Students memorize approved sequences of kings, gods, and eras. The past becomes a lineage rather than a landscape. What does not fit the lineage becomes peripheral, then optional, then irrelevant. This is not a moral failure, it is a practical one. Teaching everything is impossible. Teaching doubt is destabilizing. Societies emerging from fragility often equate doubt with danger. Stability demands confidence, even if that confidence rests on simplification. Over time, simplification hardens. What began as a teaching tool becomes a truth claim. Chronologies stabilize not because they are perfect, but because they are repeated. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity becomes authority. Authority resists disruption. New evidence is evaluated not only on its merits, but on its compatibility with what is already taught. When compatibility fails, skepticism intensifies. The burden of proof increases. Questions become risks. This dynamic shapes modern scholarship as well as ancient tradition. Fields develop paradigms that guide inquiry. Paradigms are necessary. Without them, research fragments. But paradigms also define what counts as a reasonable question. Questions outside the frame struggle to find legitimacy. The result is a kind of temporal gatekeeping. The deeper the past, the narrower the gate. Claims that extend timelines backward encounter increasing resistance, not always because they are wrong, but because they threaten coherence. A longer past requires a more complex story. Complex stories are harder to teach. They resist slogans. They complicate identity. If a civilization is taught to see itself as the first of its kind, acknowledging predecessors, especially forgotten ones, can feel diminishing. It suggests contingency rather than destiny. This psychological dimension matters. History is not only a record, it is a mirror. Societies look into it to understand who they are. A past filled with cycles of rise and collapse reflects fragility. A past that begins cleanly reflects purpose. Institutions tend to prefer purpose. This preference shapes the treatment of anomalies. Evidence that suggests earlier complexity is often reframed to preserve narrative flow. Structures become ceremonial rather than technical. Knowledge becomes accidental rather than inherited. Precision becomes coincidence. Each reframing is defensible. Together they function as insulation. Insulation is not censorship, it is comfort. It keeps the intellectual climate stable. It allows progress within known boundaries, but it also accumulates tension. Over time, anomalies pile up at the edges of the narrative, pressing inward. Occasionally the pressure releases. Timelines are revised. The past grows older. Discoveries force recalibration. These moments are celebrated as advances, but they are often incremental, carefully contained to avoid cascading revision. What remains unexamined is the cumulative effect of restraint. How many questions were never asked because they seemed unreasonable? How many lines of inquiry were abandoned because they threatened to unravel too much at once? Power does not need to forbid exploration to shape it. It only needs to reward conformity. Funding, publication, and prestige follow safe questions. Risky ones wither quietly. This dynamic does not require centralized control. It emerges organically within systems that value stability. Over generations, it produces a self-reinforcing map of the past, detailed in places, blank in others, with the blanks accepted as natural. The unsettling implication is not that history has been deliberately falsified, but that it has been curated under pressure. Pressure to teach, pressure to unify, pressure to reassure. In such conditions, the possibility of earlier civilizations becomes awkward. It introduces discontinuity where continuity is preferred. It raises the spectre of forgotten failure. It suggests that the present order is not the culmination of a long ascent. but a temporary configuration. Temporary configurations unsettle authority, and so the idea remains at the margins, entertained as speculation, allowed as metaphor, rarely integrated as possibility. The margins, however, are where patterns accumulate unnoticed. This does not mean that institutions are enemies of truth. They are guardians of it under constraint. But guardianship always involves trade-offs. What is guarded most fiercely is often coherence. As individuals, we inherit these constraints. We learn what questions feel legitimate. We internalize the boundaries of the possible. Over time, those boundaries feel natural, even when they are historically contingent. The deep past sits beyond these boundaries. It is easy to treat it as unknowable, and in doing so, to stop listening. But silence does not mean absence. It may mean that the language we use to listen is inadequate. If earlier civilizations existed, their memory would have passed through many filters: catastrophe, survival, power, pedagogy. By the time it reached us, it would be distorted, fragmented, and quiet. Expecting clarity at that distance may be unreasonable. What remains reasonable is attention, a willingness to notice tension without demanding resolution, to hold complexity without collapsing it into certainty. History does not end where our comfort begins. It continues beneath it, layered and unsettled. As we move forward, the question shifts subtly. It is no longer about whether power erased the past, but about how power shapes our willingness to imagine it, whether we allow the past to be larger than our narratives or insist that it fit. Because fitting the past into a narrow frame does not make it smaller. It only makes our understanding thinner, and thin understanding stretched over deep time begins to tear. The next layer to examine lies not in institutions or texts, but in moments when those frames are challenged, when discoveries surface that refuse to stay at the margins, and the response reveals more than the evidence itself, for it is often in resistance, not acceptance, that the true shape of a story becomes visible. Resistance has a rhythm of its own. It does not announce itself as fear, but as procedure. When discoveries appear that stretch the frame of accepted history, the response is rarely outrage. It is method, requests for replication, demands for tighter dating, calls for alternative explanations. Each step is reasonable. Together they form a current that slows movement until momentum fades. There are moments when the ground yields something unexpected, an artifact too old for its context, a structure misaligned with its assigned culture, a layer that refuses to behave. These moments do not arrive as revolutions. They arrive quietly through reports, surveys, and footnotes. They are introduced with caution, surrounded by disclaimers, framed as puzzles rather than provocations. What follows is revealing. Debate narrows, focus shifts from implication to error. Could contamination explain it? Could natural processes mimic intention? Could dating be off by centuries, millennia? More? Each question has merit. Each question also delays synthesis. The discovery becomes an isolated case, severed from the larger pattern that gives it meaning. Patterns are dangerous because they invite revision. A single anomaly can be absorbed. Many anomalies require explanation. When anomalies accumulate, the frame begins to strain. This is when resistance intensifies, not as denial, but as containment. Containment is subtle. It appears as specialization. A finding belongs to geology, not archaeology. Or to archaeology, not history. Or to history, not anthropology. Each field examines the piece within its own logic, often without integrating it into a broader narrative. The result is fragmentation without resolution. Fragmentation protects stability. It allows evidence to exist without consequence. Knowledge becomes compartmentalized, its disruptive potential diffused. The past remains intact, even as pieces of it do not fit. This process is not unique to any era. It is visible throughout the history of ideas. Paradigms shift slowly, not because evidence is weak, but because coherence is valuable. Changing a timeline changes curricula. Changing curricula changes identity. Identity resists change. The human cost of revision is often overlooked. Scholars build careers within established frameworks. Their language, methods, and authority are shaped by consensus. To challenge that consensus is to risk isolation, not because others are hostile, but because systems reward alignment. As a result, many researchers choose caution. They present findings without speculation. They avoid larger claims. They let the data speak, knowing that speaking softly reduces resistance. This restraint is ethical. It's also limiting. Over time, a curious inversion occurs. The absence of bold claims is taken as absence of bold implications. The quiet becomes confirmation. What is not emphasized is assumed to be insignificant. Yet significance does not require volume. Some truths whisper because they have been whispered before. Consider how often discoveries that later reshape history were initially dismissed or ignored, not because they were false, but because they arrived too early. The context was not ready. The questions they raised were inconvenient. Acceptance required not just evidence, but a shift in imagination. Imagination is the most regulated resource in scholarship. Evidence can be debated, but imagination defines what evidence is allowed to mean. Without imagination, data accumulates without insight. The idea that earlier civilizations may have existed sits precisely at this boundary. It is not disprovable in the simple sense, but it is disruptive. It reframes anomalies as residues rather than mistakes. It invites synthesis across disciplines that rarely converge. Because of this, it is often treated as speculation rather than hypothesis. Speculation can be entertained without commitment. Hypotheses demand testing. Testing demands resources. Resources follow legitimacy. This circularity keeps the idea at arm's length, and yet the tension persists. Each new discovery that pushes dates backward, each new alignment that suggests inherited knowledge, each new layer that complicates the story, adds pressure. The narrative does not collapse. It thickens. Thick narratives are uncomfortable. They resist summary. They complicate teaching. They blur the line between certainty and possibility. But they may be closer to reality. The resistance to earlier civilizations may reflect not disbelief, but exhaustion. To accept them would require rethinking too much at once. It would require acknowledging that history is not a clean arc, but a series of interrupted attempts. That progress is not guaranteed. That forgetting is common. These are not ideas societies prefer to centre. They do not inspire confidence. They do not promise destiny. They suggest humility. Humility, however, is not weakness. It is a stance toward uncertainty. It allows questions to remain open without becoming threatening. It recognizes that knowledge is provisional, shaped by what survives. In moments when humility surfaces, progress occurs. Timelines extend. Complexity increases. The past becomes older, stranger, and more human. Each extension once seemed impossible. Each now feels obvious in retrospect. This suggests that what feels unthinkable today may feel inevitable tomorrow, not because evidence will suddenly appear, but because the frame will shift enough to accommodate it. What might that shift require? Perhaps not new discoveries, but new connections. A willingness to see patterns where we were taught to see noise. A readiness to let anomalies converse with one another. Such readiness does not abandon rigor. It deepens it. It asks not only whether something can be explained away, but whether explaining it away preserves or impoverishes understanding. The past does not demand belief, it demands attention. Attention is uncomfortable. It lingers where answers are incomplete. It resists closure. It allows the possibility that our current story is not wrong but unfinished. If earlier civilizations existed, they would not announce themselves clearly. They would leave traces that confuse, not confirm. They would surface as questions, not proofs. Expecting certainty from deep time may be an anachronism. What deep time offers instead is pattern and probability. It suggests that given enough time, complexity will arise. Given instability, it will fall. Given survivors, fragments will persist. This cycle requires no grand lost empire, only repeated human attempts to organize meaning under shifting conditions. Seen this way, resistance to the idea of earlier civilizations becomes less about evidence and more about readiness. Readiness to accept that the human story is longer, less flattering, and more fragile than we prefer. The discoveries at the margins do not ask us to abandon reason. They ask us to expand it. To allow the possibility that our maps are incomplete, not because we have failed, but because the terrain is vast. As the pressure builds, the question changes shape. It is no longer whether the past can be revised, but how much revision we are willing to tolerate without losing our sense of coherence. Because coherence has a cost. It simplifies, it reassures, it also excludes. An exclusion, repeated over centuries, creates a silence that feels natural until someone listens closely enough to hear that it is not empty. Perhaps the task now is not to force the past to speak clearly, but to become better listeners, to accept that history may answer us obliquely, through resistance as much as revelation. If the truth of earlier civilizations lies anywhere, it may lie not in a single discovery, but in the accumulation of discomfort, felt whenever the evidence refuses to settle. And if discomfort persists, it may be because the story we tell ourselves is not yet large enough to hold what the past is trying to return. The next question, then, is simple and unsettling. If the frame is expanding, what will finally push it beyond its limits? And when it does, will we recognize the moment as discovery or as loss of certainty? Certainty is a fragile comfort. It feels solid only because it rests on what has not yet been disturbed. When the frame of history begins to expand, it does not shatter all at once. It stretches, it thins. And in that thinning, questions that once felt distant move closer, quieter, more personal. If civilizations existed before the ones we recognize, then their disappearance was not dramatic in the way stories prefer. No final monument, no clear ending, just a gradual fading. Structures eroded, knowledge fragmented, meaning redistributed into forms that could survive. What remains would not announce itself as civilization. It would appear incomplete, ambiguous, and easy to misclassify. This may explain why the search for earlier civilizations often feels frustrating. We expect cities, technologies, written records. We look for mirrors of ourselves. But earlier worlds, shaped by different constraints and losses, may not resemble us closely enough to be recognized on our terms. What if their cities were coastal and are now underwater? What if their tools were organic and decayed? What if their knowledge was preserved not in books, but in practices that no longer appear extraordinary? Absence, in this case, would be a consequence of preservation bias, not proof of non-existence. We often underestimate how selective survival truly is. Stone endures, but not all stone. Metal corrodes. Wood rots. Textiles vanish. Even inscriptions fade when languages are lost. Over deep time, only fragments remain, and fragments rarely tell complete stories. The temptation is to demand clarity where only residue exists, to ask for proof when what survives is implication. But implication is not weakness. It is the natural state of evidence across immense spans of time. Consider how little would remain of our own civilization if stripped of electricity, global infrastructure, and continuity. Skyscrapers would crumble. Digital archives would disappear entirely. The most persistent traces might be land alterations, scattered materials, and inexplicable alignments. Future observers might debate whether these were intentional or accidental. They might misread purpose entirely. Seen this way, the ambiguity of the deep past becomes less suspicious. It becomes expected. What unsettles is not that evidence is incomplete, but that it points consistently toward interruption, toward cycles rather than straight lines, toward forgetting as a recurring condition rather than an exception. This reframes the question of first civilization into something more subtle. Perhaps there was no singular first. Perhaps there were many beginnings, each believing itself original because the memory of previous attempts had thinned beyond recognition. If this is so, then the urge to locate a definitive origin is misplaced. The story may not begin at a point but recur across patterns. Civilization may be an activity rather than an identity, something humans do when conditions allow and lose when they do not. This perspective does not require advanced ancient technology or global empires. It requires only time, vulnerability, and repetition. Over enough millennia, even modest societies could rise, adapt, and vanish without leaving obvious signatures. The discomfort comes from recognizing ourselves in this pattern. We prefer to imagine permanence, we invest in legacy, we document obsessively. Yet the same forces that may have erased earlier civilizations remain active. Climate shifts, geological events, social instability. None of these belong to the past alone. What protects us now is not superiority but circumstance, a window of relative stability, a moment where accumulation outpaces erasure. Moments like this have existed before. If earlier civilizations left behind only fragments, perhaps that is all any civilization ever leaves. Not because of failure, but because time is indifferent to completeness. It keeps what it can and releases the rest. This realization softens the demand for proof. It invites a different posture, one of attentiveness rather than certainty. Instead of asking why there is no clear evidence, we might ask what kind of evidence deep time permits. Deep time favours patterns over particulars. It preserves alignments more readily than explanations. It retains repetition better than novelty. It leaves behind echoes rather than voices. Perhaps this is why so many clues feel indirect, why they appear across disciplines rather than within one. Why geology, mythology, astronomy, biology, and archaeology each hold pieces that only align when viewed together. No single field can reconstruct the whole. The picture emerges only in overlap, in the spaces between established categories, and those spaces are often where scholarship feels least comfortable. Discomfort, however, is not danger. It is a signal that the frame may be too tight. That understanding has reached the edge of what it can comfortably contain. The idea that we are not the first civilization does not demand belief. It demands patience, a willingness to sit with uncertainty without forcing resolution, a readiness to accept that some questions may remain open, not because they are unanswerable, but because answering them requires a different way of listening. Listening in this context is not passive. It involves re-examining assumptions, noticing patterns previously dismissed, allowing multiple lines of evidence to coexist without immediate reconciliation. It also involves humility, a recognition that our current knowledge, however advanced, is contingent, that our records may one day be as fragmentary as those we study now, that our certainty may appear quaint to future observers piecing together what remains. If earlier civilizations existed, they are not hidden behind a veil of secrecy. They are dispersed across time, diluted by loss, visible only when we relax our expectations of what civilization should look like. Perhaps the greatest barrier to recognizing them is not lack of evidence but excess confidence. Confidence that history has been fully mapped, that the past conforms neatly to our categories, that beginnings are singular and endings are final. Time does not support such clarity. It erodes boundaries. It blends episodes. It turns conclusions into interludes. As this thought settles, the question that once felt academic becomes existential. If civilizations rise and fall quietly, leaving only partial traces, then what does it mean to belong to one? What responsibility does that place on the present moment? Perhaps the purpose of examining the deep past is not to uncover lost glory, but to cultivate awareness. Awareness that continuity is fragile, that memory must be tended deliberately, that meaning is not guaranteed to survive. If earlier worlds were lost not through catastrophe alone, but through forgetting, then remembering becomes an ethical act. Not remembering specific facts, but remembering vulnerability. The past does not ask us to fear collapse. It asks us to notice it as a possibility, to recognize that the line we stand on is thinner than we like to believe, and in that recognition, something shifts. The question of whether we are the first civilization becomes less important than the question of how we inhabit this one. Because if we are not the first, then we are also not exempt. And if we are not exempt, then what matters most is not how long we last, but what, if anything, is carried forward when silence returns. The answer to that question remains open. It always has. In the end, the idea of a first civilization dissolves into something quieter and more difficult to hold. It fades not because it is disproven, but because it begins to feel like the wrong question. The deeper one looks, the more the past resembles a tide rather than a foundation, advancing, retreating, leaving traces that are partial, rearranged and easily misread. What remains consistent across all these layers is not achievement, but fragility. Civilizations do not end because they lack intelligence. They end because intelligence depends on continuity, and continuity is never guaranteed. Climate shifts, landscapes change, social bonds strain, memory thins. None of these require failure. They require only time. This realization alters how the present moment feels. Modern civilization often imagines itself as exceptional, buffered by technology, protected by foresight. Yet the very complexity that grants power also multiplies points of failure. Systems become efficient but brittle. Knowledge becomes vast but centralized. When disruption arrives, recovery becomes harder, not easier. The deep past offers no prophecy, only pattern. It suggests that what matters most is not what is built, but what can be remembered. Not what is known, but what can be carried when conditions change. Earlier in this journey, the absence of clear evidence felt unsettling. The missing cities, the silent centuries, the discontinuities in knowledge. Now, those absences begin to feel inevitable. Time does not preserve intention. It preserves accident. It keeps what happens to endure, not what deserves to. If earlier civilizations existed, they are not hidden behind secrets. They are dissolved into the ordinary, into coastlines reshaped beyond recognition, into myths stripped of context, into numbers repeated without explanation, into instincts passed on without memory of origin. This does not diminish the past, it humanizes it. Perhaps earlier societies believed themselves to be permanent too. Perhaps they documented obsessively. Perhaps they assumed their knowledge would outlast them. If so, the distance between them and us is smaller than it appears. What separates civilizations is not capability, but circumstance. The notion that we stand at the peak of a singular ascent is comforting. It implies direction, meaning, purpose. But comfort is not the same as truth. The past, when allowed to speak indirectly, suggests repetition rather than culmination, and repetition carries responsibility. If civilizations rise and fall, then the measure of a civilization is not how high it climbs, but how it prepares for forgetting. What redundancies it builds into memory. What values it embeds so deeply that they survive distortion. What knowledge is distributed rather than hoarded? This perspective reframes the question of legacy. Instead of asking what monuments will remain, we might ask what patterns of care, restraint and awareness could persist even when names and dates are lost. Stone does not care who shaped it. Numbers do not remember why they mattered. Stories forget their authors. What survives is not identity, but influence. The past, then, is not a warning carved in stone. It is a whisper carried forward by habit, a suggestion that survival is not enough, that continuity requires intention. If earlier civilizations were lost, it may not have been because they failed to understand the world, but because they underestimated how easily understanding slips away, because they trusted permanence in a universe that does not promise it. This realization does not demand anxiety. It invites gentleness toward the past, toward the present, toward the limits of what can be known. History in this light becomes less about certainty and more about attention, less about answers and more about listening, not for definitive conclusions, but for recurring themes that reveal how humans respond to instability. We respond by building, by measuring, by recording, by telling stories, by assigning meaning to what survives. And when meaning fades, we rebuild it again, often believing we are the first to do so. Perhaps that belief is necessary. Perhaps originality is not a historical claim, but a psychological one, a way to act decisively without the paralysis of inherited loss. But somewhere beneath that belief, a quieter awareness persists, a sense that what we are doing has been done before, that the ground beneath us has carried weight, memory, and silence long before our time. This awareness does not ask us to abandon progress. It asks us to contextualize it, to hold achievement lightly, to recognize that intelligence is ancient but continuity is rare. If we are not the first civilization, then we are also not the last to ask these questions. Others have likely wondered where they stood in the sequence of things. Others have felt the same mixture of confidence and unease. What distinguishes moments is not certainty, but curiosity, the willingness to look backward without nostalgia and forward without arrogance. The past does not accuse us, it observes. It offers patterns and waits to see if they are noticed. As this journey comes to rest, nothing resolves neatly. There is no final proof, no hidden map revealed, no singular lost world reclaimed. There is only a widening sense of time, deep, layered, indifferent to our categories. And within that depth, a choice. We can insist that history begins with us, ends with us, and moves in a straight line towards something guaranteed. Or we can accept that history is older, stranger, and more fragile than we were taught, and act with the care that such fragility deserves. The second choice does not promise comfort. It offers awareness that civilization is not a possession, but a condition, one that must be renewed continuously, one that can be lost quietly, one that leaves behind echoes rather than explanations. If we listen closely, those echoes do not tell us what will happen next. They tell us only this: forgetting has happened before, and remembering is never automatic. The night does not ask us to solve the past before we rest. It asks only that we acknowledge its depth and our place within it. Somewhere beneath our feet, beneath layers of time and silence, are traces of lives that once felt as immediate and permanent as our own. They are not calling out. They are simply there, waiting, not to be proven, but to be noticed.